Hi, this is Tom for PokerVIP.com and welcome to part one of a four-part series where we are going to review John's play in his bankroll challenge on Betfair. For those of you that don't know, John is doing two pot limit Omaha bankroll challenges, details of which should be below, so feel free to check this out on the PokerVIP forum. And yeah, just follow how he's going, what his progress has been so far, and yeah, he gives like reasonably regular updates, so you can just check his progress, see how he's doing. So before we press play on the video and start reviewing, what I will say is his bankroll management is fairly aggressive. I assume if he happens to bust the account, he's just going to reload and start again. If you are playing Omaha or looking to play Omaha, I'm going to advise that you have 40 to 50 buy-ins. That way, if you happen to have some variance, have a downswing, you're still going to be able to play at the stake that you currently are. Won't have to move down too far and won't bust your account. So that being said, let's jump in. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to say that the program I'm using to kind of review all this stuff is Odds Oracle. Now I've kind of already ran all the simulations and I'm going to bring those up as and when I need them. But yeah, for the moment, we are not going to be inputting them manually. It's going to take too long. This video is probably going to be pretty long anyway. So yeah, we're just going to bring them up as and when we need them. So the first hand we're going to review is on the left-hand table. We're just going to basically say straight off the bat that's far too loose to be defending. We want to be defending multi-way, something around the range of 40% basically. And this hand is just not going to be doing that. So yeah, as we can see here on the simulation we've run previous, against the 40% range, it just illustrates how poor in hot card equity we're doing, and also the fact that the flop equity distribution, which is very important as to how often we're going to have the 33% required to continue, it's not doing that well. And the other problem we have is that the curve goes down fairly quickly. We want a curve more sort of along these lines where it's going to flop really well, really often. This hand's just not really going to do that. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but I think that's just too loose to defend. So as it is, he happens to get a pretty bad flop, and he's just going to end up check folding, which is absolutely a-okay and totally fine what he is presented with. So we're going to see a hand on the right-hand table in a second, which is kind of an interesting one, actually. So first off, he's going to be defending the King 10 7-7. This is going to be a far better defend. You know, it's granted our opponent is like short stack. If you see me sort of switching off camera, I've made a lot of notes on this, so I'm just referring to them to make sure that what I'm saying is reasonably structured and I'm not going off topic and weird tangents and that sort of stuff. So yeah, reasonably good defend. It's going to flop moderately well. The presence of the king high flush is really going to help the hand. Like if this were rainbow, then the value of it is going to drop significantly. So yeah, just straight off the bat, just going to show that against that 40% range, it's doing significantly better. Still, you know, still not perfect, but like it's much closer to you know, profitable defend. Flop equity distribution is a bit better, as you can see. The curve is slightly more gradual. And yeah, it's from the fact that we can make more straights, make more flushes, make sets, make better two pairs, that whole jazz, which is definitely, you know, to our advantage. So this is where things get kind of interesting. So we flop a 10. And we're going to pause the video in a second. So yeah, straight off the bat, Fishy Tings has decided to lead, which is kind of a weird play, to be honest. So given that he's leading as two people, and especially into someone who's short stack, we have to give him a bit of credit. Now, as we see later in the video, two things do appear, you know, further on. The first one is that Fishy Tings plays pretty loose. So that means we don't have to give him quite as much credit, but in a vacuum, I might be giving someone quite a lot of credit here. The second thing is that John plays crazy loose. So yeah, this kind of stuff is kind of out there and weird. So the raise, we're going to focus on the positives to start with. The positive is that he has top pair and he blocks, you know, the nut boat. The negatives are that Fishy Tings, if he has 5x, as we see later on, from the way he plays, he's just not going to fold, truthfully. So it really depends how wide we think Fishy Tings is going to raise. The other, lead. The other issue we have is that the player behind, the cutoff raiser, It's quite short stacked, so if we happen to get action back, we're suddenly in a situation where the stack to pot ratio is as such that we have to call off in a spot we're almost certainly behind, and that's going to be to our detriment. So I ran a couple of simulations as to exactly what I thought that Fishy Tings was going to lead. So this is just going to be in hot and cold equity. It's not going to take into account fold equity, etc. And we really need to factor those in when we're going to be, making decisions like this. So in this instance, I gave him eights plus on this one. Random 10s and random 5s. You see we're not doing stunningly well versus that. In fact, we're doing particularly badly. Now, what I would say is that his 8s and his 9s are going to fold. And that within this range, aces aren't going to exist. They're going to 3-bet, and kings, probably 3-bet, not always. So it's not 100% representative, but it's also indicates the general trend we have with this hand, that we are turning what is quite a bit of a value having a bluff catching hand into a weird merge raise. I'm not really sure what he was trying to achieve here. What I will say is that he probably picked the right players to do it against. I'm really puzzled as to what would happen if this hand continued on. So if we run the action, we're going to see that Fishy Tings is going to elect to fold. And a question that I would pose to John, and you can pose to him in the PokerVIP forums, is what is he going to do if he happens to get called? Now, the obvious things is he's going to continue on a 10, he's going to continue on a 7. But barring those cards, what does he do? What does he do on a king? Does he use an ace as a bluff card? Or is this purely just a one-shot deal and he's shutting down if he gets called? In which case, he's probably better served playing this as a bluff catcher. But, it worked. So, there's always that. I'm going to pause it here. On the left-hand table, this is actually a very good ISO. Now, first off, our opponent, we do have 3 aces. So that's kind of to our detriment. But even so, despite the fact we have 3 aces of the rainbow variety, in position, this is absolutely fine. And we're going to illustrate the maths straight off the bat. So if I gave my opponent a 30% raising range, let's hypothetically say that our opponent raised. Even then, we're ahead of it. Now, our flop equity distribution with this hand is going to be kind of polarized just by the very nature of the hand, having 3 aces and being rainbow, which isn't, is to our detriment. But when we're lowering SPR, flop equity distribution doesn't become so important anyway, to be honest with you. But the simulation that is particularly pertinent to this instance is where we give our opponent a 10 to 50% range. We're going to assume that he raises the top 10% range, and that seems a very reasonable assumption to make. It may even be wider. Maybe this is 15 to 50% limping range. We can't truthfully tell. We have to make our best educated guess. But this is, reasonably okay. And we see in pure hot and cold, we're doing fine. We're doing all right on the flop equity distribution. But the point is, we're in position. We're going to be able to see bet the guy off on a lot of boards, assuming we get it heads up. Something we need to focus on pre-flop is what outcome are we expecting. Now, if we're opening in early position, there is a greater probability that we're going to get multi-way action. So we need hands that are really going to focus on having multi-way potential, and that's going to be top, really big pairs and big broadways, suited, double suited, that can make the best 2 pairs, that can make the best sets, can make the best straights, can make the best flushes. When we're in later position, hands are far more likely to go heads up. As such, we don't need to focus so much on hands that play multi-way. They're still going to be in our range for sure because they are strong hands, but we can focus on hands that are going to play better in heads-up spots, and this is definitely going to be a hand that plays better in a heads-up spot. So yeah, just something to consider whenever you're raising in any position is what is the most likely outcome to occur. As we see, get a reasonably safe flop. Obviously, 7-6 exists. There's some weird 2 pairs, but as Omaha goes, it's a reasonably dry flop. And John decides to c-bet, which we're absolutely fine with. We have a lot of King X in our range. We're actually ahead, doing better than that. And yeah, we happen to just win. The 3-5-6-4. He has raised in the small blind, and this is again one of these hands that just looks prettier than it actually is. Okay, we're against a random hand, but it's just not that strong of a hand. To illustrate this, I'm going to pull up another simulation we ran, 10 to 50. Again, I'm going to assume that our opponent is going to be 3-betting top 10% range, which again is a very safe assumption to make. And yeah, hot and cold doing terribly. The flop equity distribution in this hand is very good, but the problem is it's going to make hands that are non-nut. What I mean by that is that okay, we have the 6-3 rundown, but that's going to make low straights. Our opponent can potentially make higher straights. It's going to make low flushes that we can't value bet, and it's going to make weak 2 pairs that we're going to have as bluff catchers, or we're going to have to pay off. Because, hypothetically, if we have a 5-3, it's never going to be the best 2 pair. We can never, start pounding it for value. As it is, John gets a pretty poor flop. He does have more aces in range, but once I think he got 3-bet here, he can just fold. He has a SPR disadvantage and all sorts going on here. So we're going to pause it here on the right-hand table. We have seen a raise from under the gun, and John has decided to 3-bet. What I will say is that we're not a fan of this 3-bet. The reason is this. First off, we don't have an ace blocker, which makes it more likely that we're going to get 4-bet. This hand does disastrously in a 4-bet spot. The second reason is that the hand just really isn't that strong. And we're going to illustrate that with some simulations that we've run in Odds Oracle. So I accept that Fishy Tings is one of the looser players. And that's fine. But we don't need to over adjust versus that. So we're going to just sort of show some of the instances that we can imagine happening. So a typical cutoff range, if we play our opponent is playing what we consider to be GTO or close to it, the cutoff range, and given this opponent happens to be under the gun, but it's four-handed, so it's an effective cutoff, a cutoff range should be around 25%. Now, some people are going to recommend something more like 27, some are going to say more like 22, but 25 is pretty much in the ballpark. And as we see in pure hot and cold, we're actually behind. And that's basically because although the hand has connectivity, it's rainbow, and it has some pretty horrible flop equity distribution. And that's just because of its polarized nature. Okay, we can make some straights, but even so, it's not doing so well. The flop equity distribution, sorry, is mediocre. It's not awful, but it's also not stunning. So what I did is I ran a couple of simulations to illustrate how better this spot could be. The first one we did is we changed the King Jack 9-9 to be single suited, so we're suited to the King in spades. And we instantly see in hot and cold how much better we're doing. And hot and cold is obviously not the entire story. We're also doing somewhat better in the equity distribution to a point as well. But it also just means we're going to hit more flops. We can continue on spades. We have more backdoor outs, etc. And then this is further accentuated if we happen to take it a step further and say the hand's double suited. And this is just really going to illustrate how much suited and double suited really impacts the power of a hand. And a rainbow hand like this is just going to be significantly weaker. Whereas the previous hand with the aces, we're ISOing a limp, so we're against a far more capped range, and we can expect to just bet pick up a lot. Here, we're not closing the action. We've left ourselves open to 4-bets, which is disastrous, and we're raising a pretty strong range to begin with anyway. So we're gonna play it on, and yeah, the one positive I will say about it is that John is in position. Out of position, this would be even worse, but we're still not a fan. So we're going to pause it here because this hand this is one of the more interesting hands of the video. So John decides to bet. Now this flop is ostensibly quite good for our hand. We have an overpair. We don't have an ace on board, which would be disastrous for the hand. So it looks okay, but herein lies the problem. Our opponent knows that this range really doesn't hit us. Okay, it's rainbow. There's some straight draws out there, but our opponent can really apply pressure to us with a hand like containing any 10 basically, or hands like 9-8-7 with a pair, 7-5, 8-7-5 draws, because it's really basically our hand is face up as a one pair hand. He might assume it's more towards the kings and the aces variety than the jacks, But the point is, in terms of his actual equity, that doesn't make much of a difference. So John decides to bet, and I mean, I guess the bet is better than the check. The check, basically, we surrender, we lose every time, because with this kind of hand, it's difficult to imagine a run out on which our hand is going to improve, barring us turning the Miracle Jack. So I'm okay with it. Now, he does use a size that kind of induces with a hand that doesn't really want to induce. So I would have gone a touch bigger. I'd have gone like maybe 2.2. It also makes someone's attempted bluff raise more expensive, albeit marginally. But also, I think it just gets a slightly better result. Now, any bigger than that, I think we start risking too much and we don't actually show a return for it. So his sizing is not terrible at all, but it is what it is. So we're just going to show, if we assume that our opponent has a 5 to 25% range, how we're doing on that board. Now, again, we're going to assume the top 5% has 4 betters, which is namely going to be aces and enormous kings. Which again seems very, very reasonable to assume. And as we see, in terms of pure hot and cold, we're doing badly. We're not doing terribly, we're not doing okay. Flop equity distribution at this point doesn't really matter so much, purely because our hand's kind of polarized and the SPR has been lowered. So the lower the SPR, or stack to pot ratio, the less flop equity distribution really matters, or how many times we can expect our opponent to hit a turn with a frequency, which is another simulation we can run in Odds Oracle. It matters less because when the SPR is less, sort of hand strength goes up, in terms of like pairs become more valuable, etc. So that doesn't matter so much, but it's still a simulation worth running. So if we run the video, John is suddenly faced with a conundrum, and the conundrum is a pot size raise. And this is kind of like the disaster scenario really for John. So our opponent pretty much knows what we have. Now, he's probably going to be surprised we have jacks, but he knows we have a single pair hand, really. There are going to be instances occasionally where we have absolutely cool at the guy. We have kings and tens to make top set. We have aces and sixes and make, a set. We have ace, 10, 6, and we've made a weird two-pair. But really, he's just going to accept that happens occasionally, that it's a tiny part of range, and just take it on the chin when it happens. And really, it's not going to affect his decision-making too much. And if it happens and you're on the right side of it, then you're extremely happy, but that it is what it is. So I decided to cue in exactly what I thought our opponent would have. Now, based on the board and what we have. So I put in random tens. There are going to be some which are not within this range, hands like 10, deuce, 3, etc. Some, and you can remove those, of course, but for the time I had to do this video, I decided not to. It got me quite exhaustive. All the straight combos, which I think are very reasonable, and jacks, queens, and kings. Now, jacks are particularly unlikely because we happen to have 2 of them, but they still can exist. Queens and kings I don't expect to raise, but for the sake of completeness, we put them in, and that is the result we have. We're behind. Which is not massively surprising, and we're behind in a spot where it's very difficult for us to improve as well. So if we happen to be behind, we're probably going to stay behind. So I decided to, again, kind of alter the range slightly. We're going to take out the jacks, queens, kings, and kind of lean it more towards the draws and the tens. And it means that we're doing marginally better, but we're still behind. So all in all, this seems like a spot to just fold, find a better spot. And yeah, it's kind of a spot where we're either flipping versus a 10 or we're really kind of screwed, frankly. Anyway, John decides to hit the all-in button, I believe. He thinks about it for a while, and then he hits the all-in button and gets snap called. As we can see, he's in a lot of trouble here. He is against top 2 and a straight draw. Now, for the sake of completeness, we'll just show the equities. It's about as bad as he could have been, really, barring a set. A set would have been like hyper disastrous. But yeah, John's basically, he needs to hit a jack or some running 2 pairs. And there's some, but there's not many. So anyway, we run the video, and John being John happens to counterfeit the guy, but that's a result that is extraordinarily fortuitous and just isn't really going to happen too often. So it's a spot we should just be avoiding. Left-hand table, totally cool with just checking, taking a flop with a hand that is far better than a checking range would normally be. When check 2 on this board and we have 2 pair, we're just going to be betting and a gut shot for the sake of completeness. The right-hand table is far more interesting spot though, and that is the open. Right. So again, we're just going to illustrate that I'm going to assume that our opponent, who's somewhat loose, is going to be defending 40% from the big blind. If we assume that Royan doesn't actually put a small 3-bet in here, we're going to assume that our opponent's going to be defending 40%. Maybe he defends even more, but we're just going to plug in he's defending tight and just illustrate how poorly our hand does versus that. And that's just because it's too low. It's going to make very weak straights, very weak 2 pairs, and very weak flushes. Now, this obviously doesn't even include just how badly the payoff asymmetrics of this hand are going to be, and the reverse implied odds that inherently come with this hand. Now, the flop equity distribution is very good with this hand, just because of its connectivity, etc., but it's going to make hands that we still have to pay off with. So actually having good flop equity distribution here is kind of bad, because in all probability it's going to make the second best hand, or a hand we can't extract value from when we're playing as a pure bluff catcher. So given the price he gets, absolutely fine to call. Totally fine with that. We're just going to, again, sort of plug in some simulations we ran previously, just to illustrate how badly, we're doing. Now, I gave the button a 25% range, because I think that tiny clicky 3-bet can mean anything. The big blind I gave the standard 40% to, because I think, one, they're incredibly loose and I don't think they respect it. Even then, we're doing pretty badly. We're in 3rd place. We don't even have the 33% required. That being said, we don't need the 33% required because we actually got a cheaper price. But the point is, we're really doing pretty badly and we need to flop particularly well. Even if I include crazy loose ranges, I really tried to doctor this to a point where it would actually make sense for us to have the best hand. I couldn't really make it work within the realms of probability without really kind of having people just playing 100% range. And even then, it wasn't particularly clear cut as to how well we were doing. So yeah, just far too low down in range, and we can fold here. Especially, we have to consider this isn't even a button raise, this is a cutoff raise. Cutoff, as we've been touching on, should be around 25%. Button can be 45, 50% potentially, but even this hand isn't even going to be in that range. It's too weak for even a 50% range. And this flop kind of illustrates the problem it has. On the face of things, we have a straight draw, we have a flush draw. The problem is it's a rubbish straight draw and it's a rubbish flush draw. So kind of just illustrates the problems that come with this hand. And yeah, just didn't need to be in the spot. As it is, he happens to give up when the board pairs and a pot size bet goes in, which is totally reasonable. But probably just shouldn't have been in on this spot to begin with. Totally avoidable. Could have folded. Yeah. Excuse me while I take a drink, because this is going to be a long video and my mouth is getting dry. Okay, right-hand table again has the action. So before we run the maths on this spot, what I will say is that John's playing very loose, so people are going to make adjustments, and we see this later on in the video. He is playing too loose. There is no nice way to put it, and this 3-bet is going to be indicative of this. While the maths I'm running, and any maths you can run, whether it be an odds oracle, flopzilla, or whatever you want to use, however detailed you want to go into this sort of stuff, you should always include the variables that pure stats can't show you, which is table dynamic, how someone is playing, that kind of stuff, which, in a vacuum you can't really define. So the opinion that people are going to have of John right now, with his weird 3-bets, etc. I think this is like the 3rd time he's 3-bet on this already, and it's 3 minutes in. They're going to start thinking he's a bit loopy, and they're going to react as such. Left-hand table is quite a tight fold, but if I go through every hand, this video is going to go for like an hour and a half. So he gets called in both spots, which is not massively surprising, given his action. So I'm just going to illustrate the issue with Queen Jack, Queen 5. It's marginally ahead against, again, 50% button, 30% call, which I assume are reasonable. But it's not doing stunningly well. The flop equity distribution is pretty poor. It's quite a polarized hand. Now, if we swapped out the 5 for like a 10, for a 9, even an 8, the ability to make straights are great, especially, with a gap. The gap, you want the gap at the bottom, which so that you can still make a higher straight. So the 5's a complete dangler and a complete waste of a card. And he gets a flop that's really problematic for him, actually. And the reason is that he has a flush draw, he has an overpair. The flush draw, however, is not nutted. He doesn't know if it's live. The overpair, he doesn't want to get money in, because the moment money goes in, he's behind. So he has a hand that has some value, but he doesn't know how much value it has, and he's out of position in a spot. He's bloated with a hand that would have been fine as a call. Sorry, yeah, just a call pre, take the flop, and evaluate what type of flop he wanted. So again, going to plug in exactly what this spot sort of shows. Now this is all in. This doesn't. All the hot and cold equity is purely all in. It doesn't factor in like future actions. It assumes that everyone's all in. It doesn't kind of account for playability, etc., which hot and cold equity never will. So ostensibly we're ahead, but it's super, super marginal. The problem, however, is that if we bet here, we're basically going to fold out everything we beat, and we're going to get action off everything that crushes us. So John actually does the first thing I like in this hand, which is check. I think checking pot control is absolutely reasonable here. It gives us a chance to realize the equity we have, and it protects us from getting blown off the equity of the hand we have. He starts check turn again, which I think is reasonable. The deuce changes nothing. It never hits his range. If he bets, his hand is basically face up. And it's really weird for his opponents to have somehow hit a deuce here and made a weird two pair. I mean, it's feasible, but it's super unlikely. So yeah, I think check in, trying to hit a queen, trying to hit a flush card is exactly how to go. He hits the flush card, and it's one of the best flush cards he can hit because it removes one of the two flush combos that was beating him. So he's made second nuts. Now, once he gets to this point, I think betting is absolutely reasonable, especially when fishy ting checks. The fishy tings had theoretically bet, then we just call. I mean, barring something pot size, which, at the micros, pot sizing is basically crazy nutted, so we would actually consider folding that. I'm in favor of something between 35 to 55%. Size, a size that can get called but still punishes jack high flushes, 10 high flushes, 9 high flushes, maybe even 8 high flush, or really stubborn like King 9 that doesn't believe you, but thinks you have the ace blocker and just trying it. John goes a little bit smaller. He goes for like just under 25%. I don't think I think there's more value to be extracted. I don't think it's a massive mistake, but it does look a bit like an inducing bet. It looks like a blocker bet, so it does induce action potentially if you're against a particularly switched on player. And it'd be a really interesting question to pose to him is what he does if he gets raised. I assume he has to fold, and that would probably be the default play. But it does. This bet kind of leans towards getting raised slightly more than he would do normally. As it is, he just gets fold, which is fine, absolutely fine. He goes for value, doesn't get it. Happen. Excuse me, very parched. So yeah, pretty disastrous situation that he somehow managed to get himself out of. So, well played post flop, pre flop. I think is far too aggressive and kind of verging on the suicidal. So John decides to 3-bet again because he has 4 cards. Why not, right? But actually, this is one of the 3 bets I'm probably more of a fan of. Excuse me. Okay, I would prefer the hand was a little more connected. The 3 hurts it a bit. Let's say the 3 is an 8, a 9, a jack, a queen. It goes up in value hugely, even a 6 theoretically. But it's probably the best hand is 3-bet, truthfully. Now, this is where the math slightly differs because pure hot and cold equity is actually not doing as well. However, flop equity distribution of this hand is pretty damn good. We're going to have the 33% at the time, percent required over 70% of the time, which is fantastic for us. We're just going to flop something very, very, very often. And when we're low in the SPR, the strength of the hand we need to flop kind of goes down as well. So yeah, I mean, you don't want to get it in with a bear king without some redraw, etc. But it's one of the better hands, and a call would also be fine, but the 3-bet's fine as well. Both are reasonable. So yeah, mixing in some calls, absolutely okay. I would actually probably call more than I would 3-bet, but it's a good hand to 3-bet as well. It's hypothetically, if this were like cutoff versus button as well, fantastic to do it in position. This really does clip off. Excuse me. So yeah, get the 3-bet. Fishy Tings is going to call because he's literally called everything so far. And John goes for the check. I think checking is fine. Betting something around about like 30% pot, 35% pot is also reasonable, just to kind of make sure that we don't get bluffed off our equity. We do happen to have top pair. And I think by checking, we're basically giving up. Our opponent's going to fire 100% range. That's going to be player dependent, but I think against someone who's playing this loose, they probably are going to fire like 100% range very, very consistently. So, or close to, it's not much of a difference to firing 90% range, 100% range. So, yeah, I'm not particularly upset by the fold, but you can go either way on that. So he picks up kings next hand, and he goes for a 3-bet. Now, this is one of the weaker king combos for him to have. Excuse me, my voice goes 13 for a second. And yeah, I mean, it's fine as a call. To be honest, you could 3-bet it, but the 6 and the deuce really don't have any synergy with the kings. We do have a flush draw, granted, but you can mix 3-bets in if you want. He is quite a loose player, fishy things, but calling's fine. We also have to assume that at some point our other opponents are going to adjust, that we're going to start getting over calls, that we're going to start taking hands like this multi-way, and taking these hands multi-way in 3-bet spots is just going to be flat out disastrous. Just because they're very polarized, they need to be heads up. Which kind of leans towards a 3-bet, but when your table image is as John's is now, mixing in some calls with this just so you can show this sort of stuff down definitely has its merits. And I also think just like the style he's playing is exposing himself to more variance than really he needs to. And there's enough variance in pot limit Omaha without you kind of accentuating the problem by just 3-betting anything with a pulse. So anyway, we're gonna fast forward this, and we are going to get cobbled 4-bet by Ruan. When the video catches up momentarily. There we go. So, this is not good from our point of view. There's no way to cut it. So again, we put some, we ran the maths. Now, at the risk of occasionally being proved wrong, cold 4-bets at the micros are almost always aces of some variety, shape, or form. Very occasionally they're kings with an ace blocker, but that doesn't happen too often, even that. And we also have to assume that have to take into account the person who's 3-bet us is one of the, okay, he's not super tight, but he's certainly not as loose as fishy things. So anyway, we plug in 5%, which is perfectly reasonable as to what a 4-bet range could be. It could be tighter than that. We could plug in 3%, we could put in 2.5%, we could plug in just aces. I gave 5% because I was beefing out the range a bit more, just to illustrate that even against a wider 4-bet range, our hand is not doing well. The other thing to consider is the flop equity distribution of this hand is disastrous. It's very polarized. We're going to have the 33% required, less than half the time. So, we're going to have to fold a lot of flops if we happen to call. So I very much veer towards just folding at this point. But as we run it, there is a complication. The complication is that Fishy Tings has decided to overcall. So again, I ran some maths. Now, this is a weird spot. I'm going to say it right now. It's very strange. The cold call of the 4-bet is bizarre. So I kind of got proved wrong by what he showed up with, as a bit of a spoiler. But yeah, so to begin with, I gave the cold caller 8%, which I thought was acceptable. I mean, I really don't think he's going to call particularly wide, but, we're going to run different simulations just to show how the hand reacts versus different types of players. So this is kind of like the tighter side of thing and the more reasonable side, that our opponent's really going to fold all but the best hands, really. We're doing terribly. We have terrible flop equity. I mean, look at that curve. It goes off a cliff. We're not doing well. We're not going to flop well. It's just a disaster. So I put in some different stats just to see exactly what happened. It got marginally better versus a 20% calling range of the 4-bet, which is super wide, incidentally. But we're still not doing well. Flop equity distribution is marginally better, but is not doing particularly well. Next street equity, as you see, we don't have much. If for next street equity, what we want is loads of stuff here, where we really pick up equity on the next card. It's all here. That's indicative of just how poorly this is going to flop. The last one we kind of plug is the assumption that he calls everything he's raised. Let's assume he raises 40% and he just says, you know what, I'm going to call everything, which is maniacal, for want of a better term. Even then, we're doing badly. Flop equity distribution, terrible. Next street equity, terrible. You know, we're just, this is not a good spot. So even though we're getting an acceptable price here, you know, we're getting close to 3-1. The fact that we're going to have to fold so many flops, I actually think I'm just going to fold this. You know, I think folding is the best option. I think calling is the second best option, but I think it's not especially close between the two, to be honest with you. John, in the words of New Labour, finds a third way. He jams. There's no way this hand's ever good, this deep. It's, if theoretically we 3-bet and somebody who had less than 50 big blinds 4-bet, then the SPR is to stacked pot is to such a point that we just have to get it in and tut when he shows us aces. This isn't the instance, you know, that we're presented with here. And yeah, it's just bad jam. We're just going to be leaking money here. It's never going to be profitable. We're doing terribly. To the surprise of no one, Ruan's going to show up with aces. He's also going to smack the ace, which is considered unsporting. We lose a good chunk of change, but it's not massively surprising, to be honest with you. Not doing that well. Next turn, John raises the 10-10-9-7 single suited. I actually like this. Think he plays pretty well. We're a fan of it. You know, it's a good raise. You know, much earlier, not so much, but cutoff is fine. Absolutely fine with that. And John's going to get called. Oh, excuse me. Voice is going. Apologies, I forgot how long he tanked for. Anyway, yeah, so we find a reasonably good flop. Now, the first thing I would say is there is such a thing as a timing tell, and I think John's playing too fast. I don't think he's tilted because I don't think money means too much to him, but just take a couple of secs, just to, even if like it's purely just for show or theatrics, but I think most people benefit from just taking a little bit of time to just really mull over what they're doing. Anyway, John bets. I actually don't hate the bet. He is going to have a lot of kings in his range. He's going to have more kings than an opponent. That being said, his table image at this point is iffy. Opponents might assume he's on tilt after he's just 5-bet shit to a pair of weak kings and got stacked. It's possible he is. Who knows? That's a question to pose to him in the forum, perhaps. But yeah, when he gets the pot size raise treatment, he's going to be snap folding on the right-hand table, which is entirely fine, and opponent's just going to be crazy nutted in that spot. So there it is. We're going to skip forward a little bit. And we're going to be presented with a couple of interesting spots. First off, on the left-hand table, which has been a little lacking in action compared to the maniacal right-hand table. Totally fine with this call. This call, you know, his hand's going to play reasonably well, but it's not so strong that we want to be getting in a multi-way 3-bet spot. So I'm totally good with the call. The call on the right-hand table is reasonable as well. You know, we prefer that the suit was to the ace rather than the 7, which, you know, is going to have some payoff asymmetric problems, but or payoff symmetry problems. But you know, it's still reasonable. So the left-hand table, I actually kind of favor him betting the turn here. Now his image on the left-hand table is nothing like the image on the right-hand table. Okay, there's one player who's playing on both. Oh, sorry, 2 players are playing on both, but only one of them's in the hand. But he has some equity in the form of the flush draw. We can basically assume hard action has nothing by checking twice. And it's really difficult for Genimix, I think, Genimix, whatever, however you call the cutoff's name. It's really difficult for them to have a particularly strong hand here. They might have the occasional overpair, but you know they can't have a 4 really. There are very few in the range. And he's basically, by checking, said he doesn't have a flush draw, or at least not a good one. He doesn't have a decent straight combo, you know, 5, 6, 7. He doesn't have a 9. So I think betting 1 is going to basically print money by betting into a cat range, and 2, it protects the equity we happen to have. So I'm in favour of that, but he decides to check. And when he's bet into, he can just fold. On the right-hand table, call on flop's fine. He turns the second nizzles. And he has a blocker to the nut flush as well. So like if a spade comes off, he can turn it into a bluff. if he wants to. He might not need to, but it's an option he has available to him. Options are always nice. As I said, on left-hand table, it's just going to be folding, which is fine. I think when you play the check line, you kind of have to fold. Right-hand table, unfortunately, the board has paired, but he has a reasonable bluff-catching hand, let's be honest. The board shouldn't hit the under-the-gun range too frequently, although it can. Our opponent can have hands like Jack 10, 8, 9, although he has 6 with that. But like 10, 9, 8, 7, Jack 10, 9, 7 do exist in and under the gun range for the sake of completeness. They're going to be double suited or single suited to the jack the times that they exist, but they will be there for the sake of completeness, or at least they will be in a balanced under the gun range, which is going to be something between 10.5 and 13% depending on the player if they are playing a standard style. If you're playing somebody at the micros, they're probably not going to be playing that range necessarily, but you know, at higher stakes you will. So, you know, if it's check back, he wins every time, basically. He gets bet, and it's kind of an awkward spot. Like, his opponent can have a lot of busted flush draws. John's played the line as such that it looks like he has busted hearts, potentially had like an 8-7 that's missed, that he has, you know, a pair that turned a spade draw that's now missed. So it's kind of, it does look, you know, his opponent can potentially put a lot of pressure on him in this spot. A lot of that's going to come down to how balanced you think your opponent is. He thinks about raising with the 6 blocker. I think the issue he has is that, and I think it's the conclusion he reaches here, that the stuff that he's raising against, he's basically against a polarized range that either if he calls, he's good, and the stuff that, you know, he's crushed by, he's probably calling the raise anyway. So he decides to call in the end, and opponent rolls over 10-7, which is a little surprising, but it does exist. Yeah, he unfortunately loses that one. Skip forward a little bit, and John is ISOing hard action with the 6-6-4-3. So I ran a couple of simulations here. Now, on balance, I actually kind of like the line here. I like ISOing. I think it's good. I think against limpers it's good, but you shouldn't push it too far. And the 6-6-4-3 is potentially pushing it too far, although we do have the button. Like, if ever there's a spot to do it, the button is going to be it. So again, we gave our opponent a 10 to 50% range, which I think is fine. And again, we're going to assume that he raises top end range. And it's actually not doing so well. The flop equity distribution is very good. That being said, again, the problem with low hands is we're going to be making hands that have payoff problems. But, you know, in John's defense, he is going to be able to see bet and pick up a lot as well. So he's got that going in his favor, which, you know, pure stats aren't going to illustrate. But I did run a second simulation just to illustrate the strength of higher draws, where basically I put every card up by 2. So we got the 8-8-6-5 double suited, and just see the strength difference. It's so much better. So just to illustrate the kind of hand that you would be doing it with, and you know, the difference that you would have with it. Excuse me, and sort of how much, you know, like a couple of pips extra really makes a difference. So as we run the tape, he's going to get just the call from the original limper. And as he burns into my recording time here, and yeah, he gets an interesting flop. Now, I actually would really be in favor of continuing here. Here are the reasons. First off, it's a really difficult board for our opponent to hit. Our opponent's not going to be limping many strong aces. In fact, almost none. He's not going to have many kings. We have them. You know, our opponent cannot have top end of range. He is capped. We can have 3 aces, we can have 3 kings, we can have ace king, we can have hands like ace queen jack 10, ace jack 10, ace queen 10, all that sort of good stuff. So we have more 2 pairs, we have more sets, we have more big aces with kickers that give us straights and all that good stuff. And in actuality, we actually have a hand that has a gut shot and 2 backdoor flush draws, so we're not bluffing completely. We do have some backup equity if, you know, he happens to get stubborn with something weird that he shouldn't have limped to begin with. In actuality, John decides to check, which I'm really not a fan of. I think if you're isolating this kind of hand, and you happen to find a spot where, okay, it's not the greatest flop for this kind of hand, but you do have such significant range advantage, then press the advantage. You know, have a shot at it. As it is, he decides to bet turn when the ace pairs, which really doesn't make much sense, to be honest with you, but he gets it through, I think, purely because his opponent just doesn't have anything. So I guess it's a nice read from that point of view, but he could have just finished it street earlier. Right on table, he raises a very legitimate hand. Size the half pot, maybe he could size up slightly, but it's fine. And he gets min raised, which is just about the nuts in every way, shape, or form when someone does this. He obviously has far too much equity to consider folding. Love the call here. I think that's entirely reasonable. Turns a straight draw to go with it. Does complete more possibilities for his opponent, though. It's much easier for his opponent to have a straight. Can theoretically have a flush redraw. Although, given that we're trying to bird up at this point, whether he has a flush redraw or not is neither here nor there, frankly. Unless weirdly, like the Jack of Diamonds comes off. That's the only consideration in which it's a factor. Opponent pots, which basically tells us he does indeed have the nuts. John calls, which is, again, perfectly reasonable. And yeah, that run out kind of sucks. If that's a bluff, then Mazel tov, sir, but it never will be. So it's an absolutely fine fold. Yeah, not much more to say. He played it fine. It's a very standard line. Big fan of the way he played it. Speaking of big fan, the right-hand table, I'm actually a big fan of how he's played this hand as well. It might look like not much, to be honest, but it's actually something that often gets overlooked. So yeah, John snap folds. I actually love this fold. Here's the reason. So I'm going to, again, pull up an odds oracle simulation that we ran. That just illustrates what a 10% raising range, 3-betting range is going to do versus us here. And, you know, it could even be tighter, but I gave him a 10% range, you know, given his button, and he should be raising it a little wider. Because a 10% range is going to have so many aces and hands that have an ace with a bigger kicker, you know, big ace kings, big ace queens, big ace jacks. We're going to have to flop that much better. We're going to have to flop 2-pair or better, frankly, to continue. And we're just not going to do that often enough. The flop equity distribution is it's nothing special with this hand. It's okay, but it's going to be worse. It's going to be significantly better. We also are not in possession of a nut flush draw, so that makes a huge difference here. So yeah, love the fold. Really big fan of it. Think he played that absolutely fine. And yeah, I think he can just get himself into a lot of spots where he just finds himself in spots with reverse implied odds that are just going to lead to problems. So he avoided the entire situation, and he deserves a pat on the back for that one. That's a good fold. Opens the kings, perfectly reasonable. Good kings, much better kings than the ones he stepped off with. Gets an absolute sod of a flop, though. And yeah, we're just going to be checking around here, which is absolutely fine. Something like Jack O' 10 comes off, he could consider bluffing, but his image is kind of shot at this point, so it's questionable as to how much that succeeds. With the blockers, he is also, like, it's much more incentivized to do it heads up than into 3 people, so I think checking's fine here. You know, the bluff's fine as well, but you've got to be pretty confident it's going to work, and I don't think he can be that confident at this point. Anyway, he gets checked around. He happens to have the best hand by some hook or by crook. Nice answer. We're going to skip forward a wee bit to, there we go. Yeah, he's back at it, really. Not really sure what he's doing with this 3-bet. Yeah, really questionable. Not going to play that particularly well. It's 2 hold'em hands stitched together. We're not going to start running maths in every single situation, or this video really is going to go on forever, but yeah, there's just far better spots to do this. The fact he's getting overcalled actually illustrates how little credibility his 3-bets are now getting, and that's going to, you know, really affect his win rate. Also, I think he just isolated this, which against a limp, which is going to be too wide, perfect hand to just peel with. If he has the ace-high flush draw, entirely different scenario, but with just a 6-high flush draw, it's perfectly fine to just peel, take a flop, see what happens. And he decides not to do that, goes too wide, and gets a flop. He just can't continue on. Loses a little bit more, unfortunately. So I'm going to pause it on the right-hand video here. Now, the reason I think John bets it is that he basically assumes that no one can have 3 aces. And, you know, he can, which is true. However, he is firing to 2 people. If one of them has the ace blocker, it's going to greatly reduce the number of times he has 3 aces. And frankly, given his table image, I think if anyone, you know, most people are just going to assume that if he has ace jack or better here, they're just going to pay him off, frankly, at this point. The presence of the jack is a bit of an issue as well. There's going to be some king, queen, 10 type draws as well. And if he's going to bet this, I think he has to size up a touch as well. Maybe it's like 420, you know, fire it off. And I think if he's going to bet this, he's got to be prepared to just fire off the turn as well. Which you know, we're really firing on the maniacal side. If you have like a you know, a decent table image, it's going to work some of the time. Even then, you might just get called by like ace jack, but you've got a far better chance of success when your table image is that you are pretty much a lunatic. Then yeah, you're setting money on fire. As it is, he actually gets called in 2 spots, which is crazy. Picks up some straight draws, thinks about jamming, then reconsiders and just gives up, which probably is the better option, frankly, given he got 2 calls. But yeah, don't really think he needs to be doing too much there. Left-hand table, love the ISO against the limp, plays pretty well. Plus he has the button. Yeah, it's just a good spot to do it. Right-hand table, that's going to be a button open that's just far too wide. You know, again, like on button, we're going to be wanting to raise about 50%, and this just isn't going to be in the top 50% of hands, frankly. You know, if we look at what it's going to be doing versus calling range, which, you know, we're going to give him 12 to 50%. Again, assuming top 12 3 bets, maybe it's even tighter, maybe it's only top 8 the 3 bets. But you know, if we're assuming he 3 bets wide, again, not good flop equity distribution, not good cold equity, not particularly good next street equity, just not going to flop particularly well. Yeah, it's just too wide. We don't need to be attacking with these kind of hands, especially given the table image we have. You know, which is something that can't be stressed enough at this point. They're really tired of his stuff, and I think they're just starting to put the foot down. As it is, I think he bets and picks it up, but that's neither here nor there. That's being results oriented. Left-hand table, John 3 bets. Yeah, I'm not a fan of this 3 bet. So this hand is kind of like it's a pulling hand. We can make nut flushes, we can make straights. It's not strong enough for 3 bet. You know, the 7 and the 5, you know, kind of mean it's 2 hands stitched together again. That concept. But you know, when we're in possession of a nut flush draw, unless it's like the really strong stuff like ace, king, queen, 10, double suited, that sort of stuff. We want more people in the pot. Just it gives people more of a chance to make a lower flush versus us, and give us more chance of being paid. And yeah, so I think it's a perfect pulling hand. Just call, take a flop, and play accordingly. As it is, he goes for a 3 bet. And as we see from Red Devil, who overcalls, again, people are going to starting to realize he's 3 betting too much and adjusting, and suddenly he's taking pots multi-way. Now, this is actually one of those weird ones where he actually isn't so bothered about taking it multi-way, but still, it's not fantastic. Right-hand table, John makes the call. Again, even fishy things playing loose, and I would like to ask him what the color tags might mean, but I assume green just means aggressive or loose, passive, that sort of thing. Yeah, even against someone playing quite loose, like we still have to respect that their undergun range is going to be a bit stronger than their normal range, and we've got a call from undergun +1, and they're a new player. We have to assume that they're moderately proficient until they prove us otherwise. This hand again is not particularly great, doesn't have good synergy together, and in a multi-way spot, we're going to make weak flushes that we can't get value from. We're going to make weak 2 pairs we can't really get value from. We've got 2 card straights, one of which, you know, the 4 deuce is actually reduced in the number of straight combos it can make anyway. So fine to just fold here. Like if it got folded around to us, it's theoretically a cutoff open just about. It's definitely a button open, but cutoff it's probably not actually, unless you're playing on a particularly tight table where people are overfolding. But yeah, he decides to make the call, which is questionable in of itself. Yep. So we're going to pause it. In fact, we're going to let it run on for 2 secs, and then we're going to pause it. So John actually gets a reasonably good flop on the left-hand table. It's about as good as he can flop, really. I mean, barring being crazy greedy. And something weird's going to happen, and that weird thing is that hard action is going to lead. So we ran a couple of simulations. First off, just the pre-flop stuff, if we assume that he's opening 15% and under the gun +1, which is entirely reasonable, we see that in pure hot and cold we're not doing so well. That being said, the flop extra distribution is particularly good, but that is the reason we call with this kind of hand rather than 3-bet it. The second simulation, slightly more pertinent to this spot, is what I assume he's going to be leading. Now, he can lead some Queen X stuff here. That being said, I don't think he does purely because he's just going to get raised off it a lot. I think the hands he's going to be leading are going to be the draws, namely King Jack 10, Jack 10 8. So, for the sake of completeness, I plugged in every single Jack 10. Now, there are going to be some Jack 10s that just aren't there, like Jack 10 3 deuce, etc. But just to illustrate how it was doing. And we're actually ahead. We are ahead. We're marginally ahead, but we are ahead. So, based on the information John has here, I don't assume Queen 9 ever leads. I don't assume sets ever lead. I think they check raise. You know, given the way John's playing, I think they can assume he's c-betting most times. And yeah, so I'm a-okay with the information he has to just jam here. He does, which is absolutely fine. You know, okay, his villain did bet into 2 people with an uncapped range, but still, I think 2 pair is about as good as we can ever flop. The overcall is disastrous for us. He then hits the 5, because of course he does, and scoops a nice pot. But and based on the information he has, I think it's okay. But I don't actually think he probably should have been in the spot to begin with. And there's just one last hand to discuss. I may have to skip forward to get to it, though. Yes, indeed I do. Oh, no, 2 hands. Apologies, there's one last one. How could I forget this one? It's on the left-hand table. So we get a raise under the gun. On the right table, this is a bit of a loose defend, but given what he's defended, it's actually not as bad as it could have been. And it's a very good bluff catcher. I actually like the check down line, fine. Okay, John defends the ace queen 3-3. Now, it's an okay defend. The presence of the nut flush does greatly help the hand. Most prefer defending something like ace queen 7-7 that just makes the, well, it was obviously on this board, but in general, just because it makes the set more likely to not be bottom set. And the presence of the third club hurts the hand as well. But it, you know, it's not terrible. Certainly it would be defend heads up. Multi-way, it's a bit more ropey, but it's not terrible. So it's going to get checked round to the razor, which is entirely reasonable. It hits his range far more consistently than everyone else's. It's a very dry board. Yeah, pretty standard up until now. So he leads, you know, he fires 2/3 pot, which is entirely reasonable, very reasonable c-bet size. He's repping a pretty strong range. He's bet into 2 people, totally fine. John, I don't know what you're about to do here, but I would love to know the answer on a forum post here. John raises. I racked my brains to think of a positive here for a good 5 minutes, and I just gave up. Yeah, so we have an opponent betting into 2 people with a good amount of king X, good number of aces, on a board it's quite difficult for us to hit in terms of 2 pairs, so we're basically crazy polarized to sets and bluffs. We've been playing super loose, and we're bluffing with no blockers. So, yeah, I just can't see the reason behind this. I can't see the logic. It's going to be a losing play, and frankly, it gets the respect it deserves, which is board gamer calls, and I assume is just going to allow John to hang himself here. As it is, he sees the deuce, which is one of the worst bluff cards you can imagine, and shuts down. Now, what I would like to ask him, if this card was not a deuce and didn't pair the hand, what in earth is he doing here? Like, is he going to continue on a jack or a 10 that gives him a gut shot? Is he continuing on a 3, or does he then play that as a bluff catcher versus, you know, for fear that his opponent has 3 kings? I'd love to know the answer, because, you know, in any form of poker, if you don't have a plan as to what you're going to do on turn and river, dependent on action or, you know, on what the run out is, you know, it's going to be a losing play almost certainly. So I'd love to know what his plan here was, and maybe someone can ask him in the forum. You know, I'll try and get an answer off him as well, because I don't think I've ever been in a spot like this, so I don't actually know whether you should just continue firing off. I can't imagine you can, just because your opponent's calling range is going to be so strong. Yeah, as it is, he shuts down, which is easily the best option. And but what he was doing on the flop, I have no earthly idea. Yeah, it's difficult to be polite about that hand. Apologies, mate. That's pretty questionable. Okay, so this is the last hand. And this one's actually quite an interesting one to end on, which is cool. It's on the left-hand table, and it is the sevens. So it's going to get folded around to John in the small blind. He's going to open. It's a bit loose. We certainly could fold this hand, especially given the table image we have. You know, double suited, we'd be opening it for sure. Single suited, especially with the extra card of the suit, is ropey. It's not terrible though. So we're going to get called here, and we're going to take a flop, which you know, it's actually, so as we pause it here, it's actually an okay flop for us. We have significantly more aces in our range. We block the deuce three to an extent. We're blocking the 7-6 far more. And we actually have a straight draw of our own. And we're pretty confident if we hit the 6 here that we're good, just because we have two of the 7s. It's very difficult for our opponent to have you know, the 7-6 required to make a high straight. Or the 8-7 for that matter. So anyway, turn comes an 8, and it's actually an okay bluff card. Like, you know, we have two of the blockers. So, you know, we're kind of like betting into a slightly capped range. It's possible for our opponents to still have, you know, some two pairs. It's possible he's turned the nuts, but it's significantly less likely. So I'm okay with him firing here, but if he fires here, he basically has to fire on every river that isn't a heart. And given John's table image at this point, there's going to come a point where they're just going to say no, draw a line in the sand and start calling down with two pair, just because, you know, he can't have it every time. Sure, most people who play too many hands play like maniacs and just you know, eventually get fed up with it. And that's pretty much what happens here. In a vacuum, I like the line. I like the line if you're going to do it and you have a reasonable table image, just because, you know, you're probably going to get away with it. But when you're playing as crazy as John, I just don't think you do. Yeah, he doesn't here. Red Devil takes that time and then looks them up with Ace-8 that turned a flush draw. I mean, I think Ace-8 might be the worst hand that calls down. I mean, maybe Ace-5 does potentially, but it's towards the bottom of a calling range. But like when you'll start playing crazy aggressive and really kind of like push the envelope, people are going to adjust their calling ranges, and that's just one of the examples where that happened. So yeah, in a vacuum, if you're playing with a reasonable balanced style, you probably get it through. But I think at this point, people are just fed up with his aggression and start drawing lines in the sand. And he's kind of been a victim of his own image there. But yeah. Anyway, that covers the first part. We've got 3 more parts to go. Quite a long video, but there was a lot of material to cover here. So yeah, I hope you can join me for part 2. And until then, I've been Tom for PokerVIP.